Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Hey everybody, welcome to episode number 33 of the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name's Patrick Norris, and our goal today is to help you lead with a whole heart, a healthy brain, and a soul on fire. I'm so glad you're with us. Today, I have a special episode for you on how grief disrupts your life. To set it up, let me share three things. The first section of this podcast is about a 30-minute cut from a teaching I did called War of the Roses. The emphasis was on how grief compels us to control, avoid, and or shut down in every sphere of life, including relationships. The second section of this podcast is with psychologist Dr. Todd Bowman as we dig further into the grief circuits of the brain. And then third, next month, September 10th, during the expert week of our podcast, we'll look at how to work through our grief stories. You won't want to miss any of this episode or next month's. So this week, how grief disrupts your life, and then next month, how to work through our grief stories. These two episodes could be the most transformational messages you've experienced in a very long time. And you will enjoy today's inspiring, insightful, and energizing show. Before we jump into it, I want to invite you, your networks and staff into one of our personal discovery experiences. Personal discovery experiences are 2-hour online events with me and a psychologist therapist with a group of 6 to 20 peers as we discover the roots that drive individual stories. These training events are designed for those who want to know what drives them and to better equip those that they lead. The next cohort for church or ministry staff like executive pastors, youth pastors, and so on is August the 17th. If somebody struggles with addiction issues, our next one for that demographic is August the 31st. And then our next cohort designed for the general population is September 3rd. And then the senior pastors cohort, which is exclusive to senior pastors and leaders, will be September the 21st. To find out more, go to redinkrevival.com. But first, if this podcast is adding value to your leadership in life, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast, like it, and comment in the reviews at iTunes. Also, help us get the word out by sharing on your social media platforms. Thank you for doing that. It means so much. Go to redinkrevival.com and check out everything we're up to. And while you're there, sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post, as well as a lot of our upcoming events that you don't want to miss out on. Go now and sign up. Well, let's go now to this week's episode number 33, where we discover how grief disrupts your life. How many of you feel a little cortisol rolling through your brain? Just little fight, flight, freeze. Well, we're in the series War of the Roses. We wrap it up today. We're talking about the conflicts that happen in our relationships. That one of the greatest gifts that God's ever given us is the capacity for a romantic, exclusive relationship called marriage. It's a gift. It's awesome. It's wonderful. But it's also one of the most confusing, frustrating, difficult relationships you'll ever have. Today, as we continue War of the Roses, I want to say the principles actually cross-pollinate to all relationships. This isn't really just about romantic relationships. We're just emphasizing those for us. But the scripture tells us about our wars, where the fights come from. James said it this way: where do or what causes the wars or fights, the quarrels that come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure, or the Greek word hedon, that war in your members within you? Something's happening within you. Now, isn't it interesting? We all tend to think that the wars around us or that are a part of our lives are because of circumstances. Somebody said something, somebody did something. Could you believe what happened? Not ever realizing that the real war is happening on the inside and we're just being triggered from a circumstance. This word hedon from the Greek is where we get hedonism, or the pursuit of pleasure. The actual word itself, in the context of the Greek society that it was written in, is about being the end user of pleasure, that the purpose of pleasure is for you to enjoy it, that it's really about you. You are the customer, you're the client. There was another word that was often used in the Greek culture that was about also having pleasure, but it was pleasure gained by giving your life away, having purpose, doing something meaningful with your life. This word hedon is simply saying that when you are looking at yourself saying, I need something, I need a feeling, I need an experience, and then you arrange your life for you, inside of you, you're going to see these wars that begin to rage. This entire series, this is episode number 5, I've gone through a lot of different text and Greek words and so on. But one of the things that I want to remind you of is that James, who wrote this in James 4, he also wrote in James chapter 1, how that all temptation, and temptation as it's used is the way he's talking about it, is where you have this power that's pulling you towards something that you rationally don't want to do. It's something that is pulling you into disintegration, where you're no longer aligned with the values of who you are. When this word lust is used, it's a Greek word, epithemia, and it has to do with above, this intensity of emotion. This epithemia is epithemia, the themia part of what drives us, that later we look at, and what was I thinking? You know, and you all know what I'm talking about. All you have to do is think about some of the things that you eat, and you're like, you know, I shouldn't eat that. And then you eat it, and then about an hour later, some of us, it's like minutes later, you look at it and you're like, why'd I eat that? Y'all ever eat something that you just couldn't stay away from? And right after you ate it, I mean, right at the heels of it, you're like, it wasn't even that good. Why did I just plow through that thing like I was running a marathon and I had to finish? I had to hit the finish line. Well, that is this epithemia. And what he's talking about is this intense desire that's sitting on top of grief. I want you to capture this. It's sitting on top of rage. It's sitting on top of something that now then is needing medicated. It's needing some kind of attention. And that attention is what gives energy or power to these unwanted desires in our lives. So we have gone through these different ideas around how two people come together, and when they do, the innermost circle is the true self. It's the true you. This is the image of God that's in you, and all of us were made with unique fingerprints. You have a fingerprint unlike anybody else. It's wild to think that God could create billions of people and make all of us so unique. But did you know that your true self is where the image of God is planted in you, and you have a fingerprint of God's glory that you can express like no one else? There is a part of God in His presence, His power, His mind that is to be expressed through you, that is the true glory of God. But what happens is that image of God that God planted in you along the way gets wounded. And the woundedness is what happens whenever you are born and you inherit this fallen condition of a planet, and Adam and Eve's sin becomes now inherited by you before you ever make a choice. Then there's injury that happens in relationships. People say things, or maybe you interpret that they had ill will or that they were going to offend you, and that injures you in relationship, or what we call attachment. Then you also have accidents, natural disasters, things that now then cause you to feel this depth of loss. These injuries create for you what we're calling your wounded self. Out of that wounded self comes the controlling self. And the controlling self isn't a bad guy. It is the part of you that's trying to protect the wound. It's protecting the shame, your sense of, I don't belong, I'm not enough, I can't do anything to arrive. And so I'm always in the wounded self, living in threat. This controlling self rolls in and says, I'm going to protect you. And sometimes protection looks like there's going to be a rage expression out, this harshness. It can look like shutting down, and I have nothing to say, nothing to offer. I'm just getting in my own isolated cocoon. It can look like medication, where you self-medicate using alcohol, drugs, anything to escape whatever the moment is, to feel better about you. It could be food, it could be shopping. These are the things that the controlling self is doing, because the controlling self is trying to protect this wounded self. Now in Scripture, when we think about this true self of who we are, that would be again the image of God, or what the Bible would teach concerning walking in the Spirit. When you walk in the Spirit, you won't fulfill the lust of the flesh. The lust of the flesh would be this controlling self. In between those two are these wounds. In between those two are these griefs, or what we'll call losses. Now, Christine Presley, who is a therapist, she has blessed us to use her bears that she uses in therapy. These are the 3 bears. Over to the far left, you have the true self bear. This is the you bear in the glory of God, the image of God. The middle bear has a little hospital get well wrap around the paw, and that bear is the wounded bear. And then the third bear is actually a gorilla, and the gorilla is the controlling self. It's the one that's endeavoring to protect us. So if you can imagine, whenever a couple comes together to be married, what we often do is idolize and fantasize what a relationship could be. We think it's going to be a Hallmark movie, right? We think it's going to be full of music at the right times to make us feel so connected and alive, with tears streaming down our faces because we can't believe how fortunate we are to live in this moment. And then we get into marriage and we find out things don't always work that way. And there are conflicts, there are wars. And these wars are not happening because they said or they did alone. It's because we have some things that are wounded and injured in our attachment. We feel the threat that we are not going to survive the relationship. We do not belong. Things about us begin to rise to the fight so that we can say, I'm not going to allow this to ruin me. I'm not going to allow this to stop me. Again, when you think about that, there's no wonder why there are marriage problems. Because marriage problems generally, as people think about them, they're because, and people fill in a blank, they're because of something that he's doing, or something that she's doing, or something that he's not doing, or something that she's not doing. It could be financial. It could be something related to an emotional need. It could be something related to a sexual need. It could be any number of different things, but people will fill in that blank with a doing or a behavior, when really what is happening is the emotional wounded self is not getting a need met or is under threat. And so it gives the energy that the gorilla now then is jumping into. So how, as we've gone through this, and I want to encourage everybody to go back and watch the previous episodes. I set it all up. We go through various scriptures, try to help you see the bigger picture of where these War of the Roses happen. But I want to today dig into how do we work through grief? If every crazy is just any weird thing, any kind of stupid thing, any kind of wild thing you do to survive or to belong, and then later you look at it and say, I can't believe I said that, can't believe I did that, that's your crazy. So you're crazy. We want to help you know that crazy is coming from the power that grief has provided. So how do you work through grief? It's an interesting scripture, and I just love how when you look at the scriptures, these written ideas of wisdom, these inspired documents that for thousands of years It's been telling us what modern day science is revealing to us. And that is like this: a strong spirit of a person will sustain them in their weaknesses. A strong spirit. It all begins with a strong spirit. But a wounded spirit who can bear. My three bears? Who can bear? I just thought that would be cooler than what y'all think it is. The strong spirit of a man will sustain him in his weakness, but a wounded spirit who can bear. There's something about a wounded spirit that we have to look at. And here's the deal. We all have sustained losses. You have? I want you to think about what are some losses that you have sustained. We've all sustained them. Some of our losses are planned losses. What do I mean by planned? Well, you know, when Tina and I had Evan as our firstborn, and then Mitchell comes along 3 years later, you know, you're not thinking in that day how hard it's going to be when they actually leave. Or that when you reflect back. This weekend, I officiated a wedding in Northwest Arkansas with some of my family members, and because of that, my aunts and my dad and everybody's pulling out pictures. And they had taken pictures over the years of my family, and Evan and Mitchell are little kids. And I looked real skinny. That's a good-looking dude back then. Tina was always good-looking. She had big hair, but she was good-looking. She had Tulsa hair is what we call it. It was big. She was beautiful. My hair looked like a bomb blew up on my head, just sticking spiked straight up. But look at those little boys. And it's crazy. I feel the loss. But that's a planned loss, because you don't want them to stay at your home forever. You need them. Pack up your bags. Boys, I think you need to go to Charlotte. Boys, I think you need to go to Sydney, Australia. Get your life on. We planted. We formed. We forged. We developed. And now go and live the life that God has for you. Just come home alive. That's all I got to say. At least Zoom us, right? Well, these are planned losses, but then there are unplanned losses where you have someone who passes that you love dearly, or the loss of something financial. Have y'all ever lost something financial and you felt the deep-seated remorse from that? Or what about a dream loss? You had these dreams. A lot of people have a lot of dreams when they're in elementary age, and then they move to high school and they got these dreams, and then they still have them, and they get to their first jobs, and then over time they start thinking, I'll never have those dreams. And the loss of those dreams, we tend to want to escape. We tend to want to suppress. We tend to want to avoid at all costs. It's uncomfortable to even think about. What about the losses where you have a change of structure in a community, in a group? Maybe you had somebody you work with who transitioned. There's the feeling, if you love them, if you enjoy them, if you're like, you're the funniest, you're the most energizing person in the office cubicle, and you're gone, everything's going to change now. And the craziest person in the room is now going to dictate everything, right? And there's loss. Maybe you've transitioned from a church, and there's loss. These are all the losses that we are talking about that are unplanned. Could be even physical functionality, where I know as I'm getting older, I notice that not all of my body doesn't do everything that it used to do. And then it does other things that it didn't used to do. I don't know, just side thought here, but any of y'all men, are you realizing that you lose the hair where you want it, and you gain hair where you're like, how does hair grow there? I mean, there's hair that grows in my nose and on my nose that you're like, and I mean, overnight, it seems like you can get about an inch, and it's like, how? Well, what is it that's causing this thing to gain so much quick momentum? It's like it's got fertilizer right there on my nose, and bam, there it is. It's crazy. Well, again, you have various losses. Have you ever had a splinter where a splinter got in your foot? maybe somewhere in the base of your foot. And if you ever had a splinter in your foot, if you keep it in there, then it reorganizes everything else you do in life. If the splinter's there, you walk on your heel, you even shift your shoulders, might move your head as you hop along, and everything in your life, first of all, your body reorganizes, then everything in your home reorganizes, and the people around you reorganize. People come beside you, they have to do more around you, they have to protect you, because you got a splinter. Now, when you first begin to pull that splinter out of your foot, it hurts. Tina and I are not too sure, but what we traumatized Devin when he was like a 3-year-old, because he had a splinter in his foot, and I took him like a calf at a rodeo, and I wrapped myself around him, and he's screaming, and I'm not going to stop till I get that splinter out. And I pull that thing out, and of course, once it's out, we're good. But he was screaming with all he had. It hurts to get a splinter out. But on the other side of the hurt is healing. Otherwise, you continue to live with this ultimately disorganized state. That's exactly the way grief is. That when grief is unprocessed or it's not dealt with, it just lies below the surface. It rearranges the way you see yourself, the way you feel about yourself. You reorganize the way you do marriage, the way you do friendship, the way you do your dreams. Everything becomes adjusted around that. And so when we take that splinter out, it hurts. It hurts to lean into grief. But grief is a unique cocktail of emotions that until you lean into it, it will not work out. You can't have grief to be released or to be decompressed or to lose its strength over you. You can't do that by running from it or fighting it or suppressing it. What you have to do is lean into it and experience it and walk or work through it. And then it'll work itself out. Another example of what grief is like. Grief is where we take the profile of our stories, the various things that have happened in our lives from childhood all the way up. Whenever we have these stories that there's a grief energy around, this momentum, this power that happens in us. It's like on your computer whenever you are opening a Word document. The Word document has a grief story in it. But here's what you need to know. That Word document is actually in a file folder. And that file folder has other documents in it. And when you open one of those documents and begin to scroll down, next thing you know, you see, oh, there's another document in here. And you begin to open it, and you begin to scroll down it. And you see things you didn't even know you were going to discover. You bump into things that you've numbed out to over years and years of your life. The brain, it's interesting when it's trying to deal with grief, because what the brain does is it recognizes grief as a threat source. That's why when you get ready to cry, you seize up. You try to control it. And then you tell everybody you're sorry for crying, like it's the greatest offense known to humanity that a human would cry. And your brain is saying this is a threat. And so there is a protest. There is a resistance to the grief. Even when I'm working with people about various things, I was talking with a good friend who has struggled with alcohol. And there's a lot of denial going on around the use of the alcohol. And as I'm leaning in on their story, I want to help them, and they just let me know at the very onset, I do not want to go into my past. And I said, well, the question is what do you want more? Do you want to continue in alcoholism and ruin your deepest, closest relationships, or do you want to go into your past? Because you can't have both. Which one do you want? Do you want to have a close relationship, or do you want to deal with your grief? Or do you not want to deal with your grief? Because if we deal with your grief, you can have close relationships. If you don't, you're already, in fact, this whole conversation started because of your spouse reaching out to me. So what would you like? See, often what we do is we think, it's so uncomfortable. I didn't like living it the first time. I get it, but what happened is we didn't process it the first time. It hurt bad. We didn't have maturity. We didn't have tools. We didn't know what was going on the inside of us. And so we end up escaping, medicating, shutting down, numbing out. And then we built all of these different personality expressions that we didn't even know that we have. Have you ever heard somebody who said about their own personality expression, I'm a little bit controlling? Do you know the real essence of who you are, your true self, the true you? The big, sweet, pure bear here. Did you know that bear doesn't want to control? Well, that's just my personality. Well, that personality evolved in you because of your woundedness. People are like, well, I just want somebody to love me for me. And I just think it's interesting. We all want somebody to love us for us, but we don't want to love the other person for them. We want to change them, but want them to love us for us. The reality is that all of us are in a growing pattern. All of us are either growing or we have said, I'm not going to grow. And that then becomes what ends up being our personality. So think about that in the context of marriage and what marriage would look like as a result of that. I think it's interesting when you think about this whole grief deal. God created us with tear ducts. And it's interesting he put them in the eyes. He didn't put them under your arm. If he did, I'd cry all the time because I sweat all the time. He didn't put them somewhere else, like on the bottom of your feet, etc. He put them in your eyes. The reason he put them in your eyes is because they are a flushing system. They help you clean out the grief that you have. And yet we fight crying with everything we've got. Yet, if we'll allow the crying to happen, and what's so cool is that the crying is in the eyes or near the eyes so that we can look in the eyes of another relationship, another human being, and that actually will, like a vacuum, pull the grief out of us so that it can begin to be processed. There's times that I've told stories, and depending on the environment, I might, tell Tina a story and have no real emotion about it at all because I'm interacting with her about various stuff, context, all that. And then I talk to somebody else or a group or sit in here in the pulpit and tell the same story. And all of a sudden, a flood of that comes out of me and I just begin crying. Why? It is amazing how God has created so many different mechanisms to help us get grief to come to the surface. And yet, what do we do typically whenever that grief comes to the surface? We try to shut it down, not knowing that shutting it down actually holds it in the cycle that has always disrupted our lives. Being able to look into or to face that grief is incredibly important because from that grief, you're going to have all kinds of experiences. You're going to have depression. You're going to experience discouragement, this whole idea that you are disheartened. You'll deal with things like anxiety. You'll deal with rage. You'll deal with anything that puts you into a survival tactic. You will find yourself having your heart beating faster. Your energy level will fail. Have y'all ever been in a high grief season of whatever the losses are, or just the inner narrative of shame that's cycling over and over and over, and you've slept for 10 hours and you're exhausted still? It's those emotions. That is the grief that is zapping everything out of you. It changes your sleep habits, your appetite, and even your ability to concentrate. So when we talk about this grief, I want you to think about it in two ways. I want you to think about loss as it's expressed in grief. Grief is the concoction, the cocktail of emotions about your losses. about your losses. But I also want you to think about the past as being grief, just for the sake of trying to help us understand it. I want you to think about anxiety as being what grief is telling you a story about your future on. So the losses are, again, these feelings of grief that I won't get to experience it anymore. It's sadness, it's loneliness, it's the feeling of coulda, shoulda, woulda. But in those regrets, you grieve, but then that grief tells you a story. Now what's it mean? What does all this mean in my loss? And now then your brain begins to build this profile of anxiety or panic of what you might do. Hey, I hope you're having several aha moments about your life and leadership profiles. I remember how much it impacted me to know this about grief. In therapeutic communities, grief is often labeled childhood trauma. Times when you were either abused or neglected, in the extremes, and then everything between. These grief moments forge the way the brain functions and presents you to the entire world. Also keep in mind that grief pockets are what the Apostle Paul talked about when he invited us to envision spiritual warfare through the lens of a Roman soldier and the armor that they bear. He said that our shield of faith would quench all the fiery darts of the enemy. Fire is used throughout Scripture to refer to intensity of emotion. What the enemy is targeting are these unprocessed grief energy pockets to have access to kill, steal, and to destroy us. Psychologist Dr. Todd Bowman and I spent some time diving further into these ideas of grief and how the brain evolves around our pain stories. Our ultimate goal is to have what the Apostle Paul labeled the renewing of the mind. Our minds are not renewed by concepts. They're renewed by placing truth at the root of our griefs, causing a renewed emotional structure. Let's go now to that conversation with Dr. Todd Bowman. When we look at the backstories, everybody has a backstory. Everybody has suffering. Everybody has griefs. You know, if we define grief as being, the grief is a deep yearning for something, a deep desire for something, fused with the frustration that I can't seem to get it, or now it's impossible to have it. We have these grief stories that through suffering has been built into our brains with energy pockets. And if you have a thematic grief story where one thing after another, things that were executed by mom or dad or siblings or coaches, teachers, friends, enemies, all of those grief moments begin to build this internal and now neurobiological story that we get triggered from. That's where we get triggered. And I find when I look at grief, which in some ways is synonymous with trauma, but when I think of trauma, I have a tendency to think of a deep injury wound. When I think of grief, I find myself experiencing this idea of isolation. I'm alone, I have no support, I have no help, and I can't pull myself up with all of the effort, all of the work, all of the energy that I apply. I can't seem to get my desired goal. And that grief just continues to build. And then when I want to turn and begin to do the work on the grief, so this is what happens for me, is I can create moments. I can carve out time. And so I like to do everything around the grief, but deal with the grief. So I structure it. I structure my healing process without entering the healing process. So stuff for me would look like, okay, I'm gonna create documents that tell me the next step to take to deal with my grief. I'm gonna create some kind of tool or instrument. I'm gonna go read the books that I have. I'm gonna find the highlights and I'm gonna put some of the notes together. I'm gonna create my path. And then for me, my brain's like, oh good, now I've done that. And then it's like, well, bummer, now I got to deal with the grief again. And then it's like, well, can I create another tool? Because anything I can do to not enter the grief. So when you're dealing with somebody who is kind of the way that I have struggled, how would you encourage somebody to get over that hump where, you know, you just And part of it is you wonder, is this going to be a dynamic grief exploration, or is it going to be very subtle where I'm just taking steps and doing the work and it doesn't feel alive, it doesn't feel dynamic, it's just methodic. And so, when you enter into that, you're like, am I doing any good if it's not got fireworks in it? How would you describe, the help you would give as a professional to somebody who's defining it the way I am?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to start by kind of validating the connection that you made between grief and trauma. As you defined it, I mean, certainly that experience of grief would emanate out of the deep boundary violating wounds that trauma typically involves. So I think there's a lot more overlap, a lot more congruence between trauma and grief. Obviously we can have grief without trauma, but certainly if there's trauma, man, like grief is going to be a part of resolving that injury, which kind of ties us back into the idea of apathy that Hawkins identifies. He says when there's apathy, really we're looking at a hypoactive state, and it's one that's born out of traumatic experience. So, this kind of intersectionality between grief and trauma and apathy is one that is really intriguing to me. And kind of the word that you've teed up for me here is resistance. So the idea of resistance is what we would identify therapeutically.
Yeah.
So, part of, it reminds me of John chapter 5, the invalid man who's been there for 38 years. Sometimes we do that same story around our grief. I really wanted to get in the pool, but I couldn't get there fast enough and I lost my opportunity, and I guess I'll just get to it tomorrow. Next time the mood strikes me, right? Like next time the water is stirred, so to speak, then I'll get in the pool and maybe some healing will happen. But it does paint a profound picture of doing everything we can to deal with our grief, except to deal with our grief, right? Yeah. Like doing things around our grief without entering into our grief. And there is an apathy revealed in that. There is a resistance, I guess, if I could use that. And sometimes the resistance is the aversion to pain. Yeah. Sometimes it's the aversion to being flooded, like especially if there's a traumatic dynamic associated with that grief, that folks are trying to stay grounded. And it's this kind of double bind, right? If I want to stay grounded, but I've got to keep this locked door because there's dark, scary, painful stuff back there, but the problem is then you can't get integrated. You can't get whole because there's this dark, locked door that you don't want to open up. So the resistance serves a function. It seems oftentimes like talking about, in this instance, the grief, or if there's trauma beneath it, the trauma, that trying to explore the functionality that the apathy or the aversion or the resistance to the grief entails. And I think so much of the best way to lean into that resistance isn't just a one-on-one conversation. Obviously we do that in the context of psychotherapy. But I think that's where the power of a group setting is just immense. That Irvin Yalom's work would suggest that there's this universalizing principle that we're not alone in our experience. So I think that's where personal development experiences, where intensive experiences become so profound. There's this moment of entering into a sense of resistance. I think back to our first Red Ink Revival intensive, and kind of the thing that joined these men was this sense of hesitancy or resistance to delve into the grief, to delve into the pain, to delve into the experiences that ultimately they shared.
Yeah.
Right? Which means there was this desire to be heard and to have this cathartic expression where the emotion that was being carried could be dealt with. And yet there was this initial resistance or apathy that was there. So, and I think, sometimes in the church, it can be worse. I mean, obviously we were dealing with pastors, and I think pastors unfairly kind of get put in this space where it's not okay for them to feel and express a lot of emotion. Yeah. And I think sometimes that's really prudent. And other times, like, that style or that response gets overgeneralized, and they do that everywhere. And then even in their own kind of personal lives, they have this non-emotive reaction to things, which, like, there might be grievance in that. There might be wounds that are being felt by the pastor, but also the pastor might unintentionally be wounding others by being non-expressive. So I think, understanding, okay, how do we create a culture where we're going to lean in, where we're going to kind of probe the resistance, but we're going to create a space where folks aren't alone in the experience. Obviously the norms, like I said, of psychotherapy, where there's rapport building, where there's trust, where there's safety, where there's attunement, and, actually group can be an even more effective way because that's spread out, not just from a one-on-one perspective, but then you've got 5, 7, 9 people in a group that are all doing that for someone in a point of pain. And just the amplitude, the significance of that moment can increase.
I notice when that happens in group, or even when I'm one-on-one with a therapist, but group is supercharged from that, is I get surprised at the kind of surge of emotion about a grief story. There's things that if you had put me in a more cognitive pre-experience where I haven't gone into the group meeting yet, and I'm just mentally processing in a forecasting way what my emotions are going to be as I tell this story, I'd be like, I'm going to tell this story and there will be no emotion at all. I mean, I'll just share it. Get in there, and I have no reason to believe or know why I do this, and I don't think it's the thing on their face, but it's almost like sometimes the grief can be even exaggerated over what it really was, but something about the group dynamic just vacuums it to the surface, and I then am able to deal with it. But I do think it's interesting, even with crying, man. You watch everybody who cries in a public or even one-on-one scenario. They'll get ready to cry, and then they'll harden up to it, and then they'll say, I am so sorry. I'm sorry. You see public speakers do it all the time. They will get ready to say something, they begin to cry, they have to contain it. And it's weird that there's something inside of us that really doesn't, it is not even the public. We're not just sorry because the public felt it, we're almost sorry because we're feeling it. We don't want to face it for ourselves. That's right. What is that about the way we function that causes us to kind of seize up whenever we feel the first surging of grief to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it kind of gets me back to the idea of aversion or resistance or apathy around grief. I mean, we're not socialized to grieve very well. And it's almost like grief is a burden to us. And to me, I just think that that's so counterintuitive. I mean, think about the times where we're called to grieve deeply. I mean, typically we're talking about the passing of a parent, the passing of a sibling, a grandparent, somebody in our lives who meant a lot and invested a lot in us. And we carry them with us in our internal working model, our sense of self and how we understand life and relationship was shaped by them. We don't grieve that well culturally. Right? You might get a couple of days off work. You might have to take a long drive or flight. You're there for a very quick progression of viewing and some meals and a graveside service, maybe a celebration of life, more meals, and then you come home. And I'm going like, whoa. And the expectation is that in that period of 3 days, you're supposed to have digested and processed and gotten over the significance of the loss. So I think there's some socialization for us around why grief is perceived as so threatening, or why we're unwilling to allow those tears to flow. And a part of that is if we're not socialized well into grief, we're not socialized well into vulnerability.
Yeah.
I'll say that again. If we're not socialized well into grief, we're not socialized well into vulnerability. And I think that's part of what we see in that public forum is this immense vulnerability showing up. And then kind of the observing ego says like, well, this is not safe. Remember, danger, like this is too vulnerable. But what's interesting about that is, the vulnerability is meant to awaken that comforting, nurturing response. And you're talking about sometimes the tears get even bigger than the original wound or the emotional response at the original experience. What I thought of was sometimes my boys, as they were learning to ride bicycles, have fallen off their bicycles. And they'll fall and they'll get up and they are sprinting over without even looking at the wound. They're sprinting over and there's this big affective response. Right. And then they look down and I calm them and connect with them and we look at it together. And there's not really blood coming out. There's a little bit of a superficial kind of topical scrape or scratch on their knee or their hand.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Right. There's a lot of vulnerability. I'm hurt. I'm vulnerable. I'm wounded. My implicit response is to move toward connection.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then somewhere along the way, in that moment where the politician, the pastor, the personality, the person at the mall, wherever it is, right? Somewhere along the way in their story, what was this instinctual response toward, right? Vulnerability, awakening, a caring response from another has become, I can't trust that the caring response is going to be there. So I have to armor up myself and stuff it down and take care of it later.
And isn't it also true? Isn't it also true that because the amygdala, which is where the emotional memory is housed, where the grief actually has a file, and all of the grief stories end up having an emotional file there, that the amygdala, when you're born, comes out primarily developed and matured. So it doesn't have the ability to verbally process or contextually process what the emotion was. So when you're a little kid and another little kid comes up and grabs your truck, you just fall into the floor and hyper exaggerate the emotional pain of the moment, because the amygdala is fully emoting without understanding all the other networks around context, being able to verbalize or even have the cognitive, because the cognitive brain that would give it reasoning actually doesn't develop fully till you're about 25. So isn't it true then that, and I've never associated these until you're saying that the amygdala, when you experience pain, it takes that pain in, and then when you're reprocessing it, sometimes you can have an exaggerated sense of that grief that's necessary to feel and to be present with, because it's coming from the amygdala. It's not coming from your rational brain. I think about a time that, I had a dog that got run over on a highway and died when I was a kid. And so I'm an adult in my, at the time, 20s, pastoring a church, and I tell that story and I just start bawling. And it's I cried about the story before. It's why did this super sensitize that as I'm telling this story? And it does seem logical from a neuroscience perspective that the amygdala is just letting it go. And yet, again, our tendency is to seize up because we don't want that vulnerability.
Yeah, what's interesting is you got me thinking here about, if I'm inside the house and one of my sons falls on their bike, I've watched them, they'll get up and look around to see if anybody saw them.
Yeah.
And if there's nobody out there to comfort them, they realize that this injury wasn't, there's not really an injury.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Right. So it's, what you're talking about is, in different contexts, when there was a different level of responsiveness or caretaking or nurturance from in one environment, you could experience, the loss of your dog, but then years later, decades later, in a different environment, the norms of safety, the norms of attunement, the norms of connectedness that are there can allow for the corrective experience. To your point, the emotion can be metabolized with a much more corrective emphasis than in the close proximity to the original loss of.
It's so amazing.
And it gets us back to what you said earlier about the body of Christ and how that's really God's design and intent for the church, is to be that mosaic of relationships where individuals can experience pain and come, and as they share it, it's felt. That burden is carried, that they're nurtured and seen and felt and supported. And in that, this metabolizing of the pain, the shame, the loss, the sadness, the disgust, the whatever, like that gets resolved. And in that way, I mean, come on, like in that way, like we are bearing the wounds of another in the same way that Jesus himself bore our iniquities on the cross.
Yeah.
And again, we're not like saving people in that, but emotionally, like we're absorbing them into his body.
Yeah. We're actually lending our brain to the other person to help regulate their brain. And, Jesus, when the last prayer, it blows my mind to think the very last thing you're going to pray, John 17, it seems like you should pray for a lot of money, because you're having to build a kingdom on this planet that is impossible to do. You're in a Roman governed society and world, and you've got a bunch of fishermen and tax collectors that are just a little clueless. And so it seems like you would pray for better staff. Seems like you would pray for a lot more money. Seems like you would pray for strategies, some kind of whiteboarding experience with the team. And what's he pray? He just cuts past all that and says, none of that's going to matter. What matters is if we can get them to be one. Father, as you and I are one with the Spirit, if we can make them one as you and I are one, all of a sudden the world will know that you've sent me. I just think that is an amazing reality, to mourn with those that mourn, and to have mercy on those that mercy is needed by, and to see people, to feel people. Thank you guys for joining us. We are so blessed that you were with us. You might be wondering, what's next? Consider attending one of our personal discovery experiences. It's a 2-hour event, or come to one of our retreats where we dig down into your story and give quite a bit of psychoeducation as to why you do what you do. You can also subscribe to this podcast at any podcast provider in YouTube. Go to redinkrevival.com to find out all the unique opportunities to grow your life and your leadership. And while you're there, again, sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post and keep you up to date with all that we're doing. Everything we're building is to resource you to be a wholehearted leader. I'd love for you to be a part of our tribe. And I can't wait till our next episode. I'm glad that you're with us today. We'll see you next time.